Okay, we're going to continue and talk a little bit about delegation barriers. There are many barriers to delegation and to delegation being done correctly. Oftentimes status, what is the patient like? The workload for both parties may be overwhelming, and so how do you delegate to somebody's workload that's already overloaded? And then how do you continue to do the task? Often this kind of requires us to think about, again, outside the box. Is there something or some other way to do this task or get this done? Is it safe to put off a task for a little while longer till we have more help? Is there something that you're not thinking of? Are you notifying the person up the chain of command, like the charge nurse or another colleague who maybe doesn't have as heavy of a workload, to see what they might be willing to help you with? And that really requires some negotiating skills. You can't delegate to a colleague that's at the same level, but you certainly can look at how does your status compare in terms of workload for you and both you and your aide versus someone else's, and not be greedy, but be a team player in the sense that you're going to also go help them when they're in that situation, and get into a habit of that in an ongoing way to promote having that kind of help when there's not an ability to really delegate. There is risk to the patient and the organization sometimes with certain types of delegation. That could be physical, but that could also be what's going on from a patient satisfaction standpoint, whether there's been complaints or problems. It may be that delegating to an aide a certain task at this point in time is just not at the best point where a patient or a patient's family member is going to be accepting of that. Obviously, lack of time, and I put in there oxymoron. Do we really have a lack of time? I mean, the time is constant. We don't have time to delegate. This you'll hear a lot of times, like you just are so buried in how many tasks are coming at you and how many problems or issues or things that you're handling. At some point you'll have a colleague who may come to you and say, what do you need me to help you with? And you're almost so overwhelmed you can't take the time right then to say or give them some things they might could do to assist you. So you have to take the time to delegate, because then you're going to gain back some actual freer time to get your head above water. So just remember that saying you don't have time to delegate to somebody is not the best plan in terms of handling stuff. We also often will be, as newer nurses, like there's a lack of trust in your aide. And then you also, as a new graduate, often want to be able to say, I can handle this. And you feel like you're having to, prove yourself, that you can do it and handle it. And you don't want to be totally dependent on somebody else. Or somehow or another, you've seen that they didn't do as high quality of work, certain individuals in that nurse aide role. And so you kind of avoid delegating to certain ones that you don't feel their skill set is good, or that you can't trust that they'll really follow through. But in the end, when you do that, all you're doing is hurting yourself, and you are not making that nurse aide accountable for their workload. So you have to go there and keep going there and validate what is not happening and provide that feedback. And if it continues to be an issue, then you need to take it up the chain to your nurse manager and let them know that you just can't delegate to these certain personnel because of the problems that you're having. Sometimes we have self-esteem issues in terms of feeling comfortable being able to give a task to somebody, or we don't feel like we're strong enough to make a decision of when is the best time to delegate or not. And so all of that kind of comes with time, but you're not going to gain self-confidence in delegating unless you're doing it. So, you got to get in the habit of making sure you do it and do it in a kind way, in a respectful way, and then help your aides to make sure that they know that you're going to be there for them as well. Using good communication skills is ultimate in that, and being a leader, but also being a helper. Sometimes you may be in settings where you really fear retribution. I have seen new graduates come out sometimes where there is very seasoned nursing assistants have worked on that unit for 20 years, and they're going to be not doing things to you, for you just because they can, and they think that you may be weaker and not able to direct them, and then they're getting away with a much easier workload. They may be uncivil to you, and then how do you handle that kind of thing? So those are some of the huge things that are concerning in terms of barriers, but things that you have to learn to be able to work around. So these are kind of the types of delegators, and I think it's important to kind of recognize these attributes, like think about yourself, like which one of these would I be? The invincible is often a new graduate one where the nurse really doesn't delegate, instead does it all alone. They're often stressed and hurried and get burnt out and feel under a lot of pressure. Sometimes they miss details because they're just so overwhelmed, and it causes resentment because over time they get very annoyed with while they're not asking to delegate things to people, they're feeling good because they're invincible, but on the other hand, they're really aggravated and annoyed with nurse aides in general. The rationalizer, they feel like they've got to explain every nuance, why they need help. Like, they don't just give the task to the person, but they kind of have to explain why and, go into a lot of explanations. They're really concerned because they're delegating that the aide might feel like they're lazy. And sometimes people like this just haven't got the confidence yet. So this is kind of moving in the role of starting to delegate some, but you're not feeling good about it. The PAL is also a kind of delegator. They want to please everyone. They're really concerned about being seen as too pushy or bossy. So if they get any kind of pushback or anything, they just totally wouldn't delegate. And what can happen from that is it really can cause mistrust or lack of respect from the nursing assistant, because they just think, well, they love it because this person's going to always swoop in and help them all the time, but they in turn are not doing their task the other way. The shining example is another type of delegator. They believe that if they're a really good example, that everybody will just do what they're doing and pick up the skills through observing what they do. But sometimes this really causes confusion and distrust because they're not really communicating very well. They just think that everybody's seeing what they're doing and should do it the way they do it. And it really can lead to some really poor patient care, because if people aren't around to always see the example, or they're too busy with what they're doing to even acknowledge what somebody's example is, then you could have huge gaps in understanding. And then there's the watchdog. And this is somebody who embraces their accountability as the nurse to the point of repeatedly and intrusively checking the work of the aide. And those of you that have worked as an aide, you may have noticed this kind of delegator that, really causes resentment. There is a way to evaluate somebody's work, give them both positive feedback or some, helpful hints on how to do something. And if they really do something very poorly, being clear, but concerned with someone's performance and giving them some guidance on how to improve their performance versus this kind of nitpicker, and that's kind of what the watchdog delegator is seen as. You have to have mutual respect. You can't demand respect. You kind of have to earn it. So people have to see that you're willing to work and help them. Feedback has to be positive and negative. Supervision and how much is always the thing. You can have one aide that's really good, it's been doing their work for a long, long time, and you love it. You punched in today, and thank God that's my aide today because I'm not going to have to supervise as much. And then there's other times you think you can apply that same level of supervision to another person who is not as good or not as trustworthy, and then you really end up finding out some things didn't get done closer to the end of your shift, and it's really problematic. So knowing that based on their capability is important. And again, communication has to be clear, and not just once, but follow up and keep on communicating. This is kind of reiterates some of the things I already mentioned about the scope of practice for each board of nursing. So you have to be aware of those things. And you may have some specific unit-based competencies. So on some units of the hospital, certain people are allowed to do certain things, but in other units, maybe they're not. So that's another element to consider. Substandard care. Under law, nurses are not permitted to passively observe substandard care. So you do have ethical responsibilities. If someone is not doing something appropriately and continues to do that, you must report that up to the chain of command. That's really hard to do because often we kind of just make do and work around somebody who's not doing things right and don't want to be the one to report them. But in reality, our license requires that we do report those things. So you have to be careful about that and make sure that you hold true to that. Cost containment. Often when we get to talking about budgetary constraints, there is a huge dilemma about we have budgetary constraints, but we need safe staffing, and not having enough staff is not a legal defense for inappropriate delegation. So you can't just say, well, I'm really busy today, so I let my aide draw blood. You will be the one on your license because you delegated inappropriately that gets taken to task by your board of nursing. When an unlicensed assistant personnel accepts a task, that they should shoulder some of the responsibility, but always know that you are going to be held accountable. You're the one who has a license, who could have something taken from you. So you have more to lose in terms of that, in terms of being sued, and we'll talk more about that when we have legal class and the legal consultant that's coming. But a nurse is obligated to answer for their own actions, including their ability to supervise. There is a lot of this direct versus indirect delegation. You physically go tell somebody, or do they just know indirectly that that's part of their job role? There are communication failures. And then what do you do when you're in doubt about something? You have to follow up. You have to go back and investigate further. So these are just some other things. We're going to talk a little bit more about team steps, how that can be an effective communication model, as well as some other models. And this is just some current trends that you may see in terms of complexity of patient care going forward. You do have your delegation and prioritization book and some tests and quizzes that you're going to be doing throughout the course that should help you get a little bit better at this as well.